Welcome back, everyone, to episode 3 of our Bleak Rides True Crime series. I've got a real doozy of a story for you today. I want to thank everyone for coming along on another true crime story and a ride. But without further ado, let's get into it. Today's story is the murder of Sylvia Likens. Sylvia Marie Likens, pictured above, born January 3rd, 1949, in Lebanon, Indiana. Died October 26, 1965, at just the age of 16, in Indianapolis, Indiana. Her ultimate cause of death, a subdural hematoma, shock, and malnutrition. Her final resting place, Oak Hill Cemetery. She is known to be the victim of torture and murder. Let's get into the story. Sylvia was an American teenager who was tortured and murdered by her caregiver, Gertrude Beniszewski. Sylvia was the eldest daughter of a couple of carnival workers who, in July 1965, were getting ready to hit the road, and they left her and her sister Jenny with a rather poor drug addict mother of 7 named Gertrude. And I tell you, what comes next is the real world equivalent of the worst horror you could imagine. The chief of homicide there in Indianapolis, and I quote, said, "This is the most sadistic act I've ever come across." It took just 3 months for Sylvia to meet her end under the care of Gertrude. And Gertrude was not alone. She had locals helping her. Further accomplices were her own children, 2 of them primarily, Paula and John. From the time she was left with Gertrude, Sylvia was increasingly neglected, belittled, sexually humiliated, beaten, starved, lacerated, burned, and dehydrated by her tormentors. Her autopsy showed 150 wounds across her body, including several severe burns, scald marks, and places where skin was just gone. Through intimidation, her younger sister Jenny, who was also left in Gertrude's care, was occasionally forced to participate in the mistreatment of Sylvia. And these things hadn't gone unnoticed. There was good people in the community, neighbors and the local rumor mill. Do-gooders would say, "What's going on with this child? Why are you treating her this way?" They would see it out in the yard or the girl screaming in the house. And Gertrude would say, "She's a sex-crazed teen who I can't keep in the house. She's brought home by the cops every night and is the worst kind you could imagine." Gertrude would spin elaborate tales as to why these things had to be done, why this 16-year-old girl had to be beaten mercilessly, tortured, before finally torturing her to such a degree, having starved her for so long that the girl died. Gertrude made Sylvia write a letter. Write a piece of paper saying, "I am a prostitute and proud of it," further backing up the story she had told everyone of the girl's debauchery and depravity knowing no bounds. So imagine, 16, younger sister in tow, you're left with a person you think's there to take care of you, and who begins torturing you in the most heinous ways possible every single day, no longer feeding you, tying you up in the basement, beating you more, having neighbors help, having your children help, exact wrath and nothing but violence upon you, all the while being painted as something you're not. She was just a 16-year-old girl, left behind by parents off to work. Sylvia's father, Lester, had made the arrangements for his 2 daughters to board with Gertrude. He and his wife were headed east to make money, and they would pay a boarding fee of $20 to Gertrude, and with the intention of coming back in November of that year to get their 2 daughters. At first, things were fine. The first couple of weeks her parents were gone. Sylvia and Jenny resided with Gertrude. They lived in the house, and the sisters were subjected to very little discipline or abuse. Sylvia regularly sang along to pop records with Gertrude's daughter Stephanie, and she willingly participated in housework. Both girls also regularly attended Sunday school with Gertrude's children, with the pastor commending Sylvia's piety. But also, within those first few weeks, the $20 sum that had been arranged to be paid by Lester had failed to show up consistently. And in response to this slight against her, Gertrude began to abuse Sylvia, starting modestly at first, spanking her on the bare buttocks with various instruments such as a quarter stick, making statements such as, "Well, I took care of you 2 little bitches for a week for nothing." Into week 3, Gertrude had beat both daughters approximately 15 times with the aforementioned paddle, after Paula had accused the sisters of eating too much food at the church supper. By the middle of August, Gertrude had focused her abuse to almost be exclusively upon Sylvia, and it's theorized her primary motivation for this was jealousy of the girl's youth. The initial abuse inflicted on Sylvia included subjecting her to beatings and starvation, forcing her to eat leftovers or spoiled food out of the garbage can. On one occasion, she was accused of stealing candy that she had actually purchased and tortured for that. Continuing in August, Gertrude's psychological terror of Sylvia increased as well, sexually humiliating her, kicking her in her genitals, telling her she could get pregnant if she hung out with boys. Sylvia had once claimed to have had a boyfriend in Long Beach she had met the summer before, and Gertrude hated her for this and tormented her endlessly for it. At one family dinner, one of the neighbor boys was over. Sylvia was forced to eat a hot dog overloaded with condiments, including mustard, ketchup, and spices. She vomited it up, and was later forced to consume what she had regurgitated as a torture for the slight. Gertrude and Sylvia got into it for a rumor Sylvia had spread about her daughter Stephanie, and was beaten mercilessly for that. In late July or August, both Lester and Elizabeth Likens, the parents, would occasionally return to Indianapolis to visit their daughters, whenever their schedule would allow them to. Scared out of their wits, neither girl exhibited any signs of distress about their mistreatment to their parents. This was likely because both were in the presence of Gertrude and her children almost immediately after Lester and Elizabeth would arrive. Now we move into the true house of terror for Sylvia Likens. No longer allowed to attend school, beaten every day, to degrees I don't want to mention. One neighborhood boy's father had seen her shambling through a parkway, covered in sores, and reported it to the authorities. He had talked to his son and found out she hadn't been attending school for some time. Whenever someone would show up and ask about Sylvia, Gertrude would respond, she'd run away. She was completely uncontrollable, sex-crazed, and out for depravity and debauchery alike. And it was just believed. People believed her. By October of that year, the abuse, the torture, it had ramped up to a fever scale. Sylvia was tortured to such a degree she became incontinent. Gertrude would then lock her up in the basement where she'd have to wet on herself as a punishment for her incontinence. The night before her death, she had confided in her sister Jenny, barely alive but just able to speak. She said, "Jenny, I know you don't want me to die, but I'm going to die. I can tell." The following day, Gertrude woke Sylvia. She forced her to write the letter, which was intended to mislead her parents into believing that their daughter had run away. On October 25th, Sylvia attempted to escape. She was so weakened from the malnutrition and the 3-month-long series of incrementally increasing destructive torture to her body, Gertrude easily caught her trying to escape and began to beat her with a curtain rod. And when she tired of beating her with the curtain rod and it was bent into a L shape, she had the neighbor boy continue to beat her into an unconsciousness. That evening, she wasn't quite dead. She had a little fight left in her. Sylvia desperately attempted to alert neighbors by screaming for help and hitting the walls of the basement with a spade. One immediate neighbor of Gertrude would later inform police she had heard the desperate commotion, and that she had identified the source as emanating from the basement of the 3850 East New York Street house. But the noise had suddenly ceased around 3 a.m. She decided not to inform police about the disturbance. The next day, several of her tormentors had gathered in the basement, where her body lay, jerking spasmodically. Still not dead, Gertrude had Sylvia's body dragged upstairs and cleaned. Gertrude's daughter Stephanie and the neighbor boy Richard decided to give her a soapy, warm bath. They dressed her in new clothes and laid her upon a mattress in one of the bedrooms. As Sylvia muttered her final wish that her daddy was there and that Stephanie would take her home, Stephanie then turned to her younger sister Shirley, exclaiming, "Oh, she'll be all right." When Stephanie realized that Sylvia was no longer breathing, she attempted to apply mouth-to-mouth. Gertrude repeatedly shouted to the children in the house that Sylvia was faking. At 16 years old, she had finally succumbed to her injuries. Right after her death, Gertrude beat Sylvia's body with her Bible, saying, "You're a faker, faker, faker." But soon after her death, Gertrude panicked and had told Richard Hobbs, the neighbor kid, to call the police from a nearby payphone. When police arrived at the address at 6:30 p.m., Gertrude led the officers to Sylvia's emaciated, bludgeoned, mutilated body, lying upon a soiled mattress in the bedroom. Before handing them the letter she had forced Sylvia to write, she claimed, clutching her Bible, that she had been doctoring this poor child, who had been left on her lawn, naked, beaten by some boys she seen take off earlier in the day. She had done all she could to save this poor girl. While cops were taking statements, Jenny, who had been taught and rehearsed a lie to police that everything had been exactly as Gertrude described, whispered to the officer, "If you get me out of here, I'll tell you everything." The formal statement provided by Sylvia's younger sister Jenny prompted officers to arrest Gertrude, her daughter Stephanie, her son John, and a few others on suspicion of murder. All would be held without bail until trial. Lacking any sign of remorse, one by one, Gertrude, her daughter Paula, her son John, and the few others that had been arrested began to talk, began to tell a story of atrocious torture carried out upon a helpless and defenseless Sylvia Likens. Sylvia finally found peace. A funeral was conducted for her at the Russell and Hitch Funeral Home in Lebanon. It was October 29th, a nice afternoon. The service was officiated by the Reverend Louis Gibson. With more than 100 mourners in attendance, Sylvia's gray casket remained open throughout the ceremony, with a portrait of her that had been taken prior to her death adorning the coffin. In his eulogy, Reverend Gibson stated, "We all have our time of passing, but we won't suffer like our little sister suffered during the last days of her life." Reverend Gibson strode towards her casket and added, "She has gone to eternity." On December 30th, 1965, the Marion County Grand Jury returned with first-degree murder indictments against Gertrude and two of her three oldest children, Paula and John. Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard were also charged with having repeatedly struck, beaten, kicked, and otherwise inflicted cumulative and fatal injuries to Sylvia Likens with premeditated malice. Prosecution was initially seeking the death penalty for all five. Moving into May, on May 2nd and May 3rd, the younger sister Jenny testified against all five defendants, stating that each had repeatedly and extensively both physically and emotionally abused her sister, adding that Sylvia had done nothing to provoke the assaults and that there had been no truth in either the rumors that she had been falsely accused of, but with fact, with truth about the punishment and torture she had endured while living in Gertrude's house, let alone what had happened to her sister. After that, each of the five were called to the stand to defend themselves. Gertrude pled innocent, claimed insanity and depression, that her house was a madhouse filled with children who would not listen, that the children had done it all, and one by one those children turned on her and did what they could to protect their own necks, saying Gertrude had masterminded it all. The trial of the five defendants lasted 17 days before a jury retired and considered its verdict. On May 19th, 1966, after deliberating for 8 hours, a panel of 8 men and 4 women found Gertrude guilty of first-degree murder, recommending a life sentence. Paula was found guilty of second-degree murder, and Hobbs and Hubbard and the son John were all found guilty of manslaughter. Upon hearing the judge pronounce the verdicts, Gertrude and her children burst into tears and attempted to console each other. The 2 neighbor boys remained impassive. Over the years, there was some parole attempts, there was some retrials. The torture house that stood at 3850 East New York Street, in which Sylvia had been tortured and murdered, stood vacant for many years after her death. Over the years, it became dilapidated, needing revitalized. There were talks about people purchasing it, turning it into a rehabilitating house for women, a shelter, but the necessary funds to complete the project were never raised. The house itself was demolished on April 23, 2009. The site is now a church parking lot. Her sister, Jenny, would go on to get married and have a few children, forever traumatized from that time in Gertrude's house, the torture house. Sylvia's Child Advocacy Center would be built in 2010 in Lebanon, Indiana. And besides countless articles, a 2007 film, An American Crime, is directly based upon the life and murder of Sylvia Likens, directed by Indiana native Tommy O'Harbor. This has been the hardest true crime story I've done yet. The level of depravity and destruction, the things I read in the stories to build this video, were mildly traumatizing to me. I always want to pay all the respects I can to the families or loved ones who are survived by these losses. And I hope I do some semblance of justice when I retell these stories. This has been another Bleak Rides true crime story. I want to thank everyone for coming along. Be safe out there, won't you?